went to a pretty rough state school here in the UK. It was only for 3 years as I ended up moving schools to complete my GCSEs, but it definitely made an impression on me, as well as leaving me with a handful of anecdotes that I don't think I'll ever get tired of telling. Most of them are pretty funny, childish antics and schoolyard gossip, that sort of thing. But one or two others tend to provoke horrified reactions from anyone I tell them to. And one of these stories is the story of when Mr. Broughton had enough. So there was this kid in my English class called Francis, and Francis was one of those hard cases in our year group. He basically did whatever he wanted because teachers knew that it was just easier to ignore him and teach the kids who wanted teaching as opposed to rising to his bait. Try to discipline him and Francis might just decide to throw a chair or something. As you can imagine, most teachers didn't want the smoke, so Francis basically ran year 10 for a while. And it wasn't just the teachers' lives he made miserable either. Anyone who wasn't in his little circle of friends was a target for his aggression. As I'm often fond of telling people, he literally fulfilled the archaic bully stereotype of stealing people's lunch money. And it was quite a while before the school threatened to get the police involved. I think they couldn't even expel him because he'd already been expelled once and no other school in his postcode would take him, so we were kind of legally stuck with him, I guess. And apparently, so was Mr. Broughton. Francis gave all his teachers a hard time, but Broughton was a kind of exception. You see, he was a big bloke, an ex-rugby player who'd tried and failed at setting up a senior rugby team when all the year 10 and 11 lads wanted to do was play football or get high. Given the chance, he'd have crushed Francis in a second. But given all the rules on how teachers couldn't touch students, Francis knew he was basically untouchable. But that didn't mean he wasn't cautious about it. Francis definitely gave Mr. Broughton an easier time than the rest, at least, until the day he decided to push the envelope. So, that day we're sitting in English class and Broughton is trying with all his might to get us to read through Act 2 of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Francis is up to his usual tricks, trying to put people off reading, making silly innuendos, generally making a nuisance of himself. Broughton starts telling him off for it. Gently, mind you, but he's still telling him to shut up and behave. Whenever anything like that happened, I just learned to zone out and let it happen. Like, as weird as it sounds, there's only so much drama you can take before student-teacher verbal confrontations just get boring. So I'm not even sure how it happened, but I just heard Francis mention something about Broughton's wife. And then a big chunk of the class did like a subdued rap battle "oh" reaction, anticipating a sharp escalation. But by escalation, I purely mean verbal. There was never any chance of an actual physical fight happening, at least not between a student and teacher. That's what I thought anyway, and that turned out to be very wrong. Usually whenever Francis brought up something personal to do with the teacher, they had long since learned to ignore it. And the thing that really grabbed my attention here was that Broughton had most definitely not ignored it. He was looking up from his desk, redder than a beetroot, just staring at Francis after he made the comment about his wife. It wasn't even that bad, I don't think. From what I heard after, Broughton had said something about leaving the rest of us to get down to business, and Francis had said, "Oh, just like your missus, sir." Honestly, it was still considerably less harsh than the majority of the abuse he doled out to teachers, but still, Broughton was looking at him like he'd just slapped his wife in front of him. "Young man," Broughton started, his voice is literally trembling with rage. "I'm gonna give you an opportunity to apologize for your comment." Francis should have taken the chance while he still had it, but it was never like him to quit while he was ahead. "Oh, struck a nerve, have I, sir?" Francis just gloated. He didn't recognize how serious the situation was about to get, and honestly, neither did I. I didn't expect Mr. Broughton to explode the way that he did. I didn't think he even had it in him, yet little did I know, he was about to teach Francis a lesson he'd never forget. "Just apologize," Broughton said, "and we can leave this here." The way he said it was so seething that the whole class was silent, waiting for Francis's retort. and I remember shifting in my seat to subtly watch whatever he was about to do. I think everyone and their dog could see something cataclysmic was about to go down. Everyone, except Francis. "Oh, touchy subject, eh, sir?" he said. "What? Did she cheat on you or something? Having it away with the milkman on the side?" At that, Broughton exploded, standing up so violently from his chair that his desk shifted a bit. He then marches down one of the rows of desks towards where Francis is sat, and Francis responds by standing up, stepping into the aisle, and throwing his arms up in the air like, "Come on then," kind of way. He'd done it before, many times than I could count, and it always ended with the teacher backing down and Francis firmly being king of the classroom. Not this time. Both of Broughton's massive rugby player hands shoot up and wrap themselves around Francis's throat. The choking sound he set out was honestly terrifying, like a sharp, constricted attempt at inhalation that just came out as a gargle. The entire class gasped as Francis threw a punch in Broughton's direction, but his reach was nothing compared to the teacher's, and his swings missed wildly as he turned increasingly red in the face. I thought Broughton might throw a punch back for a second, but he didn't. Instead, he drags Francis just a few feet toward one of the windows. These are the kind that don't open up horizontally, like a door. They're the kind that open vertically and with just a crack, if that makes sense. Safety windows, so a kid couldn't just fall out, but with an angry teacher forcing a kid towards the opening, there was still enough room for a kid to be thrown out, which is exactly what Broughton appeared to be doing. He was forcing Francis's head towards the opening, pinning him down on the windowsill before forcing his head into the opening. Through a combination of choking and struggle, Francis had barely made a sound as the entire class just sat back and watched in horror. But as soon as his head was out the window, and he's looking down 3 stories at a concrete playground, his attitude changed completely. "Sir, please, I'm sorry. Sir, no." If anyone had been about to speak up, hearing Francis talk in a way that sounded utterly terrified, it stunned everyone into silence. It was like seeing a unicorn or something you never, ever expected to see with your own eyes. A scared Francis seemed like a complete oxymoron, a total impossibility, right up until that moment. "Tell me I wouldn't be doing the world a favor," Broughton said. He was angry that his voice was cracking as he screamed. "Go on, tell me. Tell me who'd be sad if I just dropped you." At least a third of Francis's upper body is jammed out the window at that point. His legs are flailing, kicking at the chairs and desks behind him, and for one hot minute, I think everyone believed Mr. Broughton was actually going to drop Francis out the windows. And only then did they speak up. Kids were telling each other to go get the head, begging the teacher to leave it and let him go. But Broughton was just deaf to their pleas and continued to berate Francis as he forced him further and further out the window. It was only when Broughton once asked again, like, "Who's going to miss you?" and Francis responded with something along the lines of, "My mum. She'll be on her own. Please, Mum, Mum." Hearing the hardest kid in our year literally begging for his mother, that disturbed me in a way that nothing else ever really has. In the end, when all is said and done and you're staring death in the face, it really is your mum that you think of last. Fortunately for Francis, I think that was the one thing that saved him, and you could sense the shift in Broughton's demeanor almost instantly. A few seconds later, he was dragging Francis back into the safety of the classroom, but instead of carrying on the fight, Francis ran out of the classroom, clearly crying, screaming about how, "I'm going to have your job for this." And to foreign readers, this just implied that he was going to get him sacked, not that Francis was literally about to take over as English teacher. I'm sure it'll be a surprise to no one to hear that Broughton ended up losing his job. But we also found out why he'd reacted so violently. And that's because his wife, the same one Francis had so flagrantly disrespected, had recently been diagnosed with cervical cancer, and I'm pretty sure it was terminal. I'm not saying he wasn't out of order for kicking off on a student like that, but at the same time, I can understand why that was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. I think it was the same for my parents, too. Like, once they heard about Broughton getting the sack for almost murdering a student, they went into overdrive trying to find a decent school for me to prep for my exams. I left that school less than 2 months after that incident, and did a few weeks homeschooling while my parents petitioned the council for an emergency placement. It worked. I got out, and the rest is history, I suppose. But I still think of state secondary school teachers from time to time, how some of them must be living an actual nightmare on a day-to-day basis, and how fortunate I am that I don't have to do the same thing. As a teacher, I have some pretty messed up stories to tell, but the kid that still gives me the creeps, even all these years later, was just 5 years old when this memory of mine went down. He was just a little kid, but that's the exact reason I found his behavior so disturbing. If it had come from a teenager, it'd be concerning but understandable. But from a kindergartner, it was downright chilling. So, this kid was by far the most poorly behaved child I'd ever had the displeasure of teaching. Not only was he the unholy trinity of disruptive, confrontational, and demanding of attention, but they were also extremely intelligent and manipulative for their age. On more than one occasion, I basically watched this kid not just start a physical fight, but engineer fights between other kids. One time, he took this one kid's little pencil bag, walked over to the coat rack where all the backpack coats were hung, then hid the pencil bag in some other kid's backpack. At first, I just sat back at my desk and watched him out of the corner of my eye thinking, what's he up to? But then, when he went over and told the pencil bag's owner and such a kid had taken it, I realized he was trying to cause trouble. Second graders can be really mean to each other, that's a given, but I'd never seen a sophisticated and malicious scheme played out by someone so young. And it wasn't like these were isolated incidents. He did stuff like that every freaking day. I've dealt with a lot of badly behaved children before, and most of them just need a little patience, care, and attention. But seeing how this one particular psycho kid interacted with just about anyone made me think that there was much more serious issues at work. My first move was to approach our department head, as frankly, I had no idea how to progress the situation. Punishments just didn't seem to work. I was in quite a state about the whole thing, but she was fantastic. She assured me that it wasn't my fault, but also warned me that there were no quick fixes, and what would follow might turn out to be a long, drawn-out, and stressful process. We couldn't just exclude the kid, not at such a crucial stage in their development. But at the same time, something needed to be done. And that thing was bringing a child psychologist on the school board's payroll who'd spend an afternoon observing the kid's behavior. That way, they could make an official recommendation on whether or not they should be moved to a special ed class or withdrawn altogether. So, on the day in question, the psycho kid was particularly badly behaved, displaying exactly the kind of behavior I wanted the psychologist to observe. I had specifically requested that she show up in the afternoon, just in case Psycho Kid just so happened to be subdued in the morning. It was rare, but it did occur. But then, as soon as the psychologist shows up and I introduce them as a nice lady who will be watching how great our lessons are, the kid's behavior turns picture perfect for the following hour. There wasn't even the slightest bit of rude, aggressive, or manipulative behavior from them, to the point that I was actually stunned at what a radical behavior shift there'd been. Luckily, they agreed to sit on a few more sessions and would be returning on Monday for more of the same, so it's not like I was up the creek with no one believing me. But not long after, when class ended and all the kids were filing out of the classroom with their coats and bags, etc., the psycho kid looks up at me as he's leaving and says, "I did good, didn't I?" I was stunned. Somehow, without ever being prompted, the kid worked out that the nice lady was there solely to observe him. Maybe she gave the game away making eye contact one too many times. I honestly don't know, but the psycho kid knew what the deal was, and the game was essentially up. The following 2 psychologist visits, the kid behaved like a dream. please and thank you, sharing with other kids, complimenting them. Jesus, they put on such a good show that the psychologist didn't even think that there was anything amiss. And that's when the I'm not crazy moment started happening. We even discussed placing a camera in the classroom at one point, but the head of the department vetoed it on account of too many parents potentially objecting to the recording of their children. That kind of red tape is just one of the many frustrations that come with a career in teaching. Luckily, 3 months later, it wasn't even my problem anymore. Psycho Kid had moved on to first grade and to a different teacher. Then by second grade, they transferred to a different school. That was the last I heard of Psycho Kid, but I'll never forget his name. He'd be around 12 or 13 by now, and every so often, I plug his name into Google just in case anything has happened involving him. I've got nothing to date, but for some reason or another, I get the feeling that one day, I'll search his name up, only to find out that he's done something truly, truly terrible. I remember teaching a 6th grade class back in the mid-2000s that had every teacher's dream student in it. She was smart, diligent, always well presented, and her overall behavior was exemplary. On top of that, she was also quite a popular young lady and had a visibly calming influence on her fellow students. So needless to say, she proved to be pretty popular among the teaching staff too. Just imagine a person who makes your job infinitely easier. Heck, some of you might not have to imagine. Maybe there's someone at your job who just makes the day go by faster, makes things easier, someone you look forward to seeing on a day-to-day basis. And now imagine them coming up with an intricate plan to kill you. Because that's exactly what happened with this perfect student of ours. All these blog things might well have preceded the mid-2000s, but discovering our favorite student's account was the first time I heard of them. I still remember a coworker walking into the teacher's lounge looking slightly pale with urgency in their step. "You teach Samantha, right?" they asked me, and when I responded in the affirmative, they pulled out their laptop and brought up the girl's page. It contained an extremely detailed and disturbing plan of how she was going to tase, restrain, and murder myself and this other coworker of mine, all the while we were tied up, back to back, to 2 classroom chairs. The method of execution would be 1 bullet from her father's Taurus .22 pistol. And I do mean 1 bullet because she planned to shoot us in a way where the bullet would pass through my head and into the back of my coworkers. Like I said, it was extremely disturbing how detailed her plan was, and part of that was how economical she seemed to be about it. Like to her, efficiency was almost as important as the end result, like it was a challenge or something. Obviously, we took the blog to the middle school's principal almost immediately, explaining that there was a clear and present danger if the issue wasn't addressed properly. There had been a similar kind of incident involving a male student making threats to a female teacher, and this kid had been expelled almost instantly, so we were expecting similar measures to be taken. But then word gets out that all that's going to happen is a 5-day suspension following a meeting with their parents. 5 days. Myself and my coworker were just dumbstruck. This wasn't a slapping duel in the schoolyard during recess. These were well thought out, murderous ideations that were clearly a serious plan, not an edgy attempt at humor. When we took issue with it, we were assured that she'd be removed from our classes, but she'd be allowed to remain at the school for 7th and 8th grade. When we asserted that we weren't comfortable with this, the principal told us the girl would be banned from going anywhere near the 6th grade corridor, and that she'd be punished if she did so. And that was about as good as we could get it. Edit 1. I just came back to see that there's like 1,000 questions for me in the comments. Please give me a while to answer all of them, but I promise I'll try and cover as many of them as I can in another edit. Edit 2. Okay, so how exactly did my coworker find the blog? It turns out 2 of her friends ratted her out after seeing her answering questions on some website called ask.fm. Not only had she given another detailed answer on how she'd do it, but she'd actually named her 2 friends as co-conspirators. According to her, they were more than willing to help her ambush us on a dark winter's morning. Turns out they weren't, and told on her before they copped some of the blame. As for why she wanted to kill us, to this day we have no idea. The closest that we got was asking her parents if she was violent at home or whatever, but they just turned it around against us and told us that we were terrible teachers. They claimed that she was just acting out, that she simply wasn't capable of that kind of violence. When we asked if her father did indeed own a Taurus 22, there was a very telling moment of silence in which I deduced that, yes, he did. As for the punishment that actually went over our principal's head, it was the school district, not our school's admin, who decided on the ineffective 5-day suspension. They were just painting by numbers. Infraction A plus infraction B equals punishment C. There was no personal touch, no individual consideration, and sadly, that's just the way it worked out in our school district. Finally, I think it's prudent I address the veracity of the threat, since I'm seeing a lot of the, haha, you were scared of an 11-year-old girl. I'd like to remind these people that back in 2001, 12-year-old Christopher Pittman murdered both his grandparents with a shotgun he had somehow taught himself to use. Don't make the mistake of thinking that a kid can't plan an attack or operate a firearm, or generally just doesn't have it in them to commit an atrocity. Threats of violence should be taken seriously, no matter the age or status of the person making them. And even when we look like we're making mountains out of molehills, the alternative is losing people we're close to in senseless, bloody acts that are totally preventable. Attacks that are sometimes from the people we least expect. We had this substitute teacher back in 8th grade. He was real nice, but nobody took him seriously at all. He kept order by being chill, but he was a little too chill, and I think most kids just perceived that as weakness. Not to mention how, and I know it's not nice to say it, but he looked kind of funny to us. I remember not being able to quite put my finger on it, but he just had this sort of dumb look about him that definitely wasn't working in his favor at all. Anyways, we had a teacher off sick for a whole week with shingles or something, and Mr. Nice but Dumb, I'll call him, was filling in the entire time. And as you can imagine, the more the week progressed, the harder and harder a job he had of keeping us in line. It got to the point where kids were being openly disrespectful to him, and the dam broke when one kid mentioned his appearance. Gradually over the course of the week, we'd worked out that Mr. Nice but Dumb looked funny because one of his eyes was slightly off-center. So I said the dam broke when one kid was like, "What's wrong with your eye anyway?" Mr. Nice but Dumb just stopped, and what had merely been an exceptionally friendly facade dropped entirely. It was like that old book, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, seeing a person kind of transform without ever really changing in appearance. Slowly, the entire class stopped what they were doing, fell silent, and watched Mr. Dumb but Nice stalk down one of the rows of desks towards where the kid was sat. He leans in and said something like, "Oh, you mean this?" And he then reaches up and takes hold of his eyeball, and he proceeds to pull it out of its socket. As you can imagine, a room full of 12 and 13-year-olds having just witnessed something like that just lost their absolute minds. Kids were jumping up from their desk, either bailing from the room entirely or backing off and watching with grim satisfaction. You could see the inside of the guy's head. Dude, it was like this cavernous, fleshy socket, and as I was expecting a bunch of blood to come spurting out of it at any second, nothing came. It looked dry in there, and that's when it dawned on me. The guy had a glass eye. Mr. Nice but Dumb turned out to be a Gulf War veteran and had lost his eye in a friendly fire incident out in the desert somewhere. We all watched in absolute horror as he explained that the kid should be more polite with strangers, and that you shouldn't ask questions that you don't want to know the answers to. At that, he invited us all to sit back down so he could continue the lesson, but before he could, the principal shows up with one of the kids who'd bailed in tow. Mr. Nice but Dumb finished the rest of the period, then we, unfortunately, never saw him again. It kind of sucked because We had it real easy until the whole glass eye incident, and the sub we got for the last few days of our teacher's absence was kind of a jerk. So as you can imagine, the kid who asked the dumb question about Mr. Gulf War Vet's eye was not too popular after that. I grew up in a kind of messed up family. My mom's side are all from Westfield, New Jersey, while my dad's side are all from Newark. Mom's family are all clean living, church-going people. But my dad's side? Crooks, thugs, and thieves, all of them. They were never involved with the mafia or nothing like that, but they were still career criminals who tried their darndest to drag my dad down with them. Luckily, he escaped Newark and started a family nearer to his in-laws out in Westfield. They did everything they could to keep me on the straight and narrow, too, even sending me to Sunday school each week, and boy, did it suck. The guy who ran the place, Pastor John, we used to call him, was just a total jerk. He seemed to only care about two things: the Bible, and scaring the life out of us by telling us how we were all going to burn for eternity if we died with sin in our heart. I mean, it did the trick to an extent. I barely even gotten a parking ticket my whole life, but Pastor John wasn't the good Christian he made himself out to be. Not by a long shot. So this one weekend, Dad drops me off at Sunday school, only Pastor John was nowhere to be seen. In his place is the nicest lady I think I'd ever met, one who proceeded to make the lesson that followed as fun as she possibly could. Myself and the other kids were over the moon. No more getting yelled at, and this lady brought candy with her. And that was that. Miss Harris was our new Sunday school teacher, and we never heard from Pastor John again. As you can imagine, no one missed him, and no one pined for his return, and no one ever asked why Pastor John left the Sunday school. To me, it was a case of, don't let the door hit you where the good Lord split you. Decades go by. Actual decades, mind you. I start a family of my own. Mom and Dad turn gray, and in the same chair I used to drink juice boxes with my parents, I'm now drinking the same wine or beer they are. So me, my wife, Mom, and Dad are a little tipsy after dinner one night, and the kids are with a sitter, and the conversation is getting a little loose. Mom and Dad are playfully embarrassing me by telling my wife a few choice stories from my youth. Somehow, the subject of Sunday school comes up, and I say something about that jerk Pastor John. Mom and Dad just look at each other, the smiles disappearing from their faces, leaving me and my wife to ask what just happened. That's when my dad explains that Pastor John had simply disappeared one day, and the switch over to Mrs. Harris was news to them too. When they did learn, though, and what they worked tirelessly to keep from me, was that Pastor John had vanished. But only shortly after his entire family were found dead in their home. The cops thought that he was dead too for a while, that maybe he'd been kidnapped after home invaders had slaughtered his wife, kids, and mom in front of them. But then the case ran on America's Most Wanted, and the cops got a bunch of calls saying that Pastor John was living in Virginia under a different name. They go investigate, and sure enough, it's Pastor John with a fake ID, insisting he's never lived in New Jersey in his life. No prizes for the ones who guessed that Pastor John was the one who killed his family. I mean, why else would you flee and change your name? But it's the details of it that got him such a steep conviction, because he planned the whole thing to a T first. For instance, he obviously didn't want the bodies to be found for a while after he killed them, so he went about canceling the newspaper deliveries, milk deliveries, anything that might give away the fact that no one was alive in there anymore. I think he even told his kids' elementary school that they were going on vacation or something too, like the guy covered all his bases for when he made his move. Seems like he almost escaped justice too, if it wasn't for some pesky TV show. I suppose that's why they call it the long arm of the law. You can run, you can hide, but Johnny Law is gonna get you. Back when I was a high school sophomore in my hometown of Dallas, we had 3 different science teachers in the space of a year. First one left because she went on maternity leave, and the second one arrived because the second turned out to be crazier than a soup sandwich. And as much as that little turn of phrase might have made you chuckle, this story is about to get pretty dark, so strap in. As I said, the first teacher leaves to nurse her second kid, so Mr. Albright shows up. And the first thing he does is decorate his classroom with all his homemade taxidermy. Some of the girls thought it was incredibly creepy and refused to look anywhere near the little dead fox, squirrel, or the raccoon he kept on his desk. But I don't know. As much as they were kind of janky looking, he'd done a real good job with the eyes. Like he had this rattlesnake too, kept it on a windowsill, and no wonder some of the kids were creeped out because, good God, the eyes on that thing made it look alive as you and me. Mr. Albright was really weird too, but I couldn't help but hang around after class one day to ask about his taxidermy. He told me it was just a hobby, and the 3 examples he brought in were the only ones that had ever come out looking okay. That's when I complimented the eyes on the things, especially the eyes on the rattlesnake. This kind of silent pride seemed to wash over him, like he grew a few feet taller just from the compliment. I wasn't trying to kiss up or anything, they were just real good as all. But he acted like it was the best thing he'd ever heard and launches into this big speech on why the eyes are always the most important. He tells me there's nothing so intricately designed or manufactured as the human eye, how each person has a different pattern to their eyes, and they're just as unique as our very own personalities. The eyes aren't just the windows to the soul, he told me. They're the very soul itself. Kind of poetic, right? But all that was totally lost on me. I just wanted to check out that sweet rattlesnake. Cut to like 15 years later. I'm on vacation with my girlfriend, now wife, and we're watching HBO in our hotel room one night as we drifted off to sleep. It probably wasn't the healthiest thing to be watching before bed, and we both love crime and cop shows, so we're watching this show called Autopsy, about how killers are often caught through a victim's autopsy results. We're both about to fall asleep, and the way my wife tells it, she's just about scared out of her skin by my screaming, "Jesus Christ, Elizabeth, look!" She thinks there's someone about to get shot outside or something and goes to rush to the window, but I'm pointing at the TV. Because what I'm pointing at is some guy's mugshot that the Autopsy TV show is displaying, and it's unmistakably Mr. Albright. And no, he wasn't one of the victims on the show, but he was actually one of the killers. I was astounded how I'd never managed to hear about it. I know he was only teaching in our school for like 3 or 4 months, but God, being taught by a serial killer, and yes, multiple victims, was kind of a big deal. The thing that really, really creeped me out though, hearing what he'd done to the bodies afterwards. According to the narrator, Mr. Albright killed 3 people around the Dallas area in the early 90s, a couple of years after my encounter with him, and his thing was taking trophies. I'll give you one guess as to what those trophies were. Just one. You guessed it. The eyes. He took the girls' eyes after he'd killed them. Heard he died of corona last year in prison. A buddy of mine sent me the link confirming that he died, but it didn't say why. I'm just putting 2 and 2 together. Older dude, confined in prison, probably the Rona. But yeah, anyway, that's my story. And while y'all have been talking about how your teachers are creepy because they've complimented your hair, we're out here in Texas getting taught by actual serial killers. I had a 6th grade teacher who turned out to be an actual psychopath. And the worst thing is, we pretty much called it too. Lord knows why a woman might get into teaching when she seemed to hate kids so much. Like I'm pretty sure Mrs. Warmus was never the most mature person in any room, and that includes classrooms full of 12-year-olds. She was mean too, incredibly vindictive, and we always kind of joked about how she might actually just snap and go berserk one day. Like that movie Carrie, but it's a teacher and she's barely been provoked before she just locks all the kids in the gym and burns the school down. As hard as it might be to believe, Not everyone found Mrs. Warmis as repulsive as we did, and although we didn't find out until after she moved on, she was actually having an affair with another one of the teachers, a music teacher named Mr. Solomon. One night, Miss Warmis arranges a secret date with her married lover at their discreet downtown eatery of choice. But before she goes to meet him, Miss Warmis drives over to Mr. Solomon's house, not to go meet him, but to go meet his wife. Now, before all you girls jump the gun and think it's two sisters trapping the love rat, it wasn't that kind of visit. Miss Warmis knocks on the door, and when Mrs. Solomon answers, she pistol whips her and proceeds to shoot her over and over in the legs. Not to kill her, more like to torture her before she bled to death. Then, she goes inside, wipes some of the blood off her legs, then goes to meet her lover like nothing had happened at all. I heard he wanted to break up with her, and she'd been horrified at the idea. So as a little screw you, she decided that if she couldn't have him, neither could his wife. The whole thing always reminds me that sometimes a-holes just seem like a-holes. Annoying, but kind of harmless. But sometimes, they actually go on to hurt or kill people. Unchecked, a person like that just continues to become less human and more monster every single day, until it's too late to do anything about it. It was the second teaching position I ever had, and it was at this god-awful inner-city school with a power-mad principal and staff who just didn't care. I had two main problems at the time. One, the school's computer equipment was garbage and desperately needed an upgrade. I kept pushing for an upgrade, but she wouldn't release any funds because her frugal budgeting had made her the darling of the local school board. I was threatening to go public about it, and instead of just doing the right thing, I could tell the principal was looking to get rid of me. All she needed was a reason to do it. And two, the second problem was a girl we'll just call Tammy, because I can't actually name her or the school for legal reasons. Tammy was a pain in my behind, a textbook case of a disruptive student. I don't even mind if a kid just wants to show up and nap. I'm willing to just focus on the ones who want to better themselves. But a kid who makes it impossible for those kids to learn, every teacher's worst nightmare in my mind. Now, on the day it all started, Tammy was behaving particularly appallingly, and I was forced to send her to the principal's office. But when I demanded that she leave the classroom, Tammy straight up refused. I basically had to shout her out of the room like a Marine Corps drill instructor, just bellowing in her ear until she couldn't handle it anymore. I know that sounds a little harsh, but trust me, if it works, it works. I get her out in the hallway, and I'm kind of corralling her towards the principal's office, kind of impressed I'm managing to do so. But then it dawns on me that she's just walking there out of her own accord, something that was definitely not in her best interest. I ended up walking back to class, leaving her there with a smug smile. I knew something wasn't right with that picture, but I never could have guessed what was about to happen next. During lunch, the principal catches me in the teacher's lounge and asks if I can make an after-school appointment in her office, with Tammy, to discuss her behavior. She might as well have told me that she figured out how to turn base metals into gold. I'm standing there like, you managed to get Tammy to stay after school? What witchcraft is this? She assures me it's no magic and that I'm to report to her office at 3:15 sharp. For a while, I actually thought we might be making some kind of progress, like we made a breakthrough with her or something. But then, I remembered the way she smiled all smugly as I turned to walk away, and as much as I wanted to believe it, part of me always knew it was too good to be true. Because when I show up to the meeting, Tammy is in tears, and the principal seems mad at me. I won't give you a play-by-play of everything that went down, as that would be an essay in itself, but essentially, it became obvious that Tammy wasn't the one in trouble. I was. And I was in trouble because Tammy had told the principal I was touching her. Different language was used at the time, and it's not anything I'm too interested in repeating, but needless to say, it was hideous. But what was even more hideous was the realization that the principal was taking these allegations seriously, and I knew she was only doing so because she wanted me out. I'm not saying I shouldn't have been suspended for a week without pay, as, frankly, I needed the free vacation, and it's standard practice with an investigation. But the principal wasn't treating this as an innocent until proven guilty situation. She seemed to treat Tammy's hysterical display of acting as proof positive that her allegations were true. But as furious as I was, I knew they had absolutely zero physical or recorded evidence of me ever having behaved in such a disgustingly inappropriate manner, so at first I wasn't too worried. That's until the principal came forward saying there was a piece of security camera footage from 6 months prior, which allegedly catches me touching Tammy inappropriately in a busy hallway. When I actually saw the footage, I burst out laughing. I walked past her with like 4 or 5 foot berth between us, and neither of us react as we walk past. But according to the principal, who wanted nothing more than to get rid of me, this was prime evidence, and it was enough to get me an indefinite suspension while she pushed the matter forward to the school board. If they decided I should be fired, I could be looking at an arrest for child abuse. My career would be over, I'd be publicly ruined, and I'd probably see the inside of a jail cell. If I couldn't get some decent legal aid from the teachers' union, and if they too believed that I was just some freak, you could bet they wouldn't be opening up their wallets too fast. I remember sitting in my apartment, drinking a beer at like 1:30 in the afternoon, and it hit me that I might actually go to prison for something that there was no evidence of me doing. It was like everyone was in the grip of their collective madness, believing this student over me, even when they'd known that I was a good teacher for years and years prior. It was a nightmare, and I'm not ashamed to say that I cried when the drunken despair truly set in. Thankfully, that was as bad as it got, because as soon as a member of the school board saw the footage, it was clear that I was innocent. In a face-to-face meeting with them, I made the point that if Tammy was so traumatized, why wasn't she going to the cops directly? And more importantly, why wasn't the principal encouraging her to do so too? To me, the answer was clear. Go to the cops and risk arrest for filing a false report when the truth came out. Keep it an internal matter, and both Tammy and the principal could get what they wanted, which was seeing me gone. But from what I understand, the principal denied this completely, saying all she wanted was to protect her students, and in the end, she got off with a slap on the wrist, and I was offered my job back. No way. I was not about to go back to work under her again, and I ended up relying on my unemployment insurance until I could find a half-decent school with a vacancy. But it was definitely worth going back to my college diet of ramen and rice-a-roni for a while, just so I could get a better position. I had this math teacher back in 7th grade who was just an all-around creep. Even worse, he doubled as my homeroom teacher, so I was around him about every day and sometimes for hours at a time. At first, he seemed kind of quirky and annoying. Like, every day before the bell, he blasted classic rock songs from his computer and stood outside the door in the hallway just bopping to the music. I guess to try and look cool or something. I don't know. I guess I just understand why he was so determined to impress us, and it just came off as really cringe. But as time went by, he just got worse and worse. For example, he was also a girls' volleyball coach, and he once said to me that I should join a team next year because I looked like I had good volleyball thighs. I was 14 years old at the time, just a kid. If that was me now, I'd have called him out on it in a hot minute. But I was so shy and nervous, I just rationalized it away as him scouting out potential talent, which, in a way, is exactly what he was doing. One day, he asked me to stay after class because he wanted to have a quick chat. His class was my last class of the day, located on the opposite side of the school to the bus stop. If he kept me too long, there'd be a chance that I'd miss the bus. I told him that, but he reassured me that it wouldn't be any longer than a few minutes and I shouldn't worry. Class ended. I walked up to his desk. He was answering a very important email and refused to speak unless it was sent. I, having been taught to be respectful to elders, stayed standing there even as the minutes ticked by. Only once he finally spoke, all he said was that I got a 70 on the test that we had just taken and that I should try harder next time. In hindsight, I should have said, "Why did I have to stay late for you to tell me that? You could have written it on the test." But again, I was young and naive. Needless to say, the bus lot was empty when I got there. I was absolutely furious. It was like he'd literally manufactured it so that I'd miss my freaking bus, but little did I know, that had been his exact plan the entire time. I walked back to his class and told him, to which he said, Darn. Well, if you give me a minute, I can give you a ride home." I think I was too angry and naive to really see what that was. Like, of course he'd offered to give me a ride. It was his freaking fault that I missed the bus. I turned down his offer, telling him that I'd walk home. He insisted, but I marched off before I said anything I might regret. It took me 45 minutes to walk home. I was so livid, and after that, I tried to avoid him as best I could, purely out of spite. And for some reason, he was happy to give me that distance. Now, I know with hindsight, it's really easy to see what's going on, but you have to put yourself in my shoes. This was a time when kids like me just shut up and did as they were told. Teachers always had your best interests at heart, and punishments at school just extended home, too. When your teacher was mad, your parents were mad, and boy, did they ever let you know it. So I just shut up about it, and the following year, I didn't have any classes with him, so I just sort of forgot about the whole thing, not really realizing the significance of it until years later. I think it was like 4 years afterwards that I'd heard. I was definitely in my senior year of high school, but the word went around some of the girls that had attended that middle school that the old math teacher was a perv. I mean, tell me something I don't know, right? But then I heard that there had been an actual conviction. He was headed down to a state prison to do some serious time. But it was only when I'd heard how he did it that I was like, dear God. He touched one of his students after giving her a ride home after school. And when the cops talked to her, the girl said he deliberately kept her behind so that she had to accept the ride. The girl lived like 25 miles away, not walking distance like me, and it was scary thinking that as I walked out of his classroom, he must have been like, need to adjust the plan. I was so close to being that girl. That poor girl he'd finally managed to corner with his sick little tactic. And to me, that's no different than dodging a bullet. Two years ago, I decided to take art as one of my electives. I didn't have much of a choice as it was one of the only elective classes that I could fit into my schedule, but I knew some friends who were taking the class, so I was okay with it. On registration, when I received my schedule, I was surprised to see that I didn't recognize the teacher's name. The sole art teacher that we normally had was teaching a different class at the same period, so they had hired somebody new. We'll call this new teacher Mr. M. At first, Mr. M seemed really nice, a little quirky, admittedly, but he had some really cool project ideas and we were excited. Then the comments started coming. While they were a bit subtle, they definitely made students uncomfortable. It was first believed to be a joke, but the more it happened, the more awkward the class felt. The first red flag was that he'd started referring to himself as Daddy. If we'd finished a project or assignment that came out well, he would smile and nod, telling us that Daddy's proud. Honestly, it seemed like he was attempting to be endearing and that he thought of us as being similar to his kids, but it just didn't come across that way. I also remember him telling a girl one time, "Wow, that dress is nice." That's not usually a compliment given by teachers. Along these same lines, he also defended the cheerleaders' uniforms despite the majority of the school, including the cheerleaders themselves, saying that the skirts were showing a little too much. After some similar comments were made and the referral to himself as Daddy continued, we suddenly got a substitute teacher, who ended up being our teacher for the remainder of the year. Nobody heard from Mr. M ever again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in huge compilation form and save massive on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.